Right then guys, and here I am with a video I've been wanting to make for a long time. And since the story mode will be returning to the F1 series in F1 23, now is as good a time as any. Obviously, we don't know what F1 23 story mode will be like as the game isn't out yet, but EA and Codemasters are clearly putting in a lot of marketing effort and resources into it, which is encouraging if you want a story mode in the F1 games. But if you do, then there's reason to be excited about it. I first talked about the idea of having a story mode in an F1 game nearly 4 years ago, when I reviewed F1 2019. Even just since then, we've had F1 2021's Breaking Point, Grid Legends Driven to Glory, MotoGP 22's essentially interactive documentary of the 2009 MotoGP season, and if we turn our attention to films, then since then we've had Ford v Ferrari, and that film's great. Not to mention the upcoming influx of productions based around Formula 1, and there's the Gran Turismo film coming out later this year. The main point I made back in 2019, bearing in mind the F1 games are yearly released, licensed sports titles with more than just a story mode to focus on, is that for it to be a well written and long narrative, it is going to be railroaded heavily. Realistically, you're not going to get a Detroit Become Human style narrative with all the possible permutations accounted for. And once you remove player agency and the element of randomness, you take away what I consider to be one of the main appeals of the F1 games. 4 years ago I listed off a load of anecdotes, and I could do the same now. And anyone who's poured a fair amount of time into the F1 games, whether that be offline or online, a standard career mode or a deliberately challenging or weird race, and trust me, I've definitely done a lot of the latter. Trying to make Ragunathan successful springs to mind, but it's that element of randomness and freedom for anything to happen in terms of mistakes made by you or others around you, safety car deployments, weather changing the entire state of a race, mechanical failures. All of that is what makes races in the F1 games so great. And I'm not saying the F1 games are perfect, because they're absolutely not, for plenty of reasons, more so recently, but I can't think of any other racing game in recent years that organically creates compelling and unique offline races as well as the F1 series has done for years. That's partly down to the nature of the sport it's emulating, and that's the key word: sport. Those epic moments anyone who's played the F1 games will have were made all the more exciting knowing that anything could have happened, and so for something as bizarre as those to have occurred naturally makes them all the more special. And fundamentally, isn't that one of the major reasons we like sport? Not just F1 or motorsport, but sport in general. It's knowing that nothing is scripted and theoretically anything could happen. Essentially, a story with a predetermined outcome misses the appeal of some video games and all sports. I'm not knocking stories in games. The Last of Us, both the game and the recent TV series, are testament to how good they can be. But in a racing game, it's a different matter. F1 2019 just had the beginnings of a story mode, and F1 2021 took that idea and expanded upon it. Breaking Point was fine, but actually quite a basic story. The only standout moment in the story for me was the team dinner scene, and that's because it's the only moment in the whole of Breaking Point that takes place outside of the F1 paddock. And if you want to tell a fleshed out narrative with characters that feel like human beings, and not just people who are defined by a couple of character traits, then you need some actual storytelling and not just a sequence of moments on track. FIFA's story modes went further in terms of the number of characters, delving into their backstories and personalities, and the story spent a fair bit of time off the pitch. The journey story across FIFA 17, 18 and 19 I felt was pretty good considering it was a story in FIFA. But it's not really what people look for in a FIFA game, and it didn't do well enough for EA to continue it. Well, there was a much smaller scale story in Volta, but even that has been steadily phased out. Grid Legends had the Driven to Glory story mode and some extra strands that came out as DLC. Callum McGowan played Nathan McCain brilliantly, and props to Shuti Gatwa, who seemed to be having the time of his life when filming for that game. It was a simple story with mostly one-note characters, but at least I had a few more of them compared to Breaking Point, including team bosses, your engineer, and even the second driver in the rival Raven West team who exposes them for cheating. Plus there was Claire as a journalist figure which helped, along with some of the backgrounds in some of the scenes and how much was visibly going on in them, to make the whole thing feel bigger and more alive. TOCA Race Driver, the first two games and not the third, since everyone calls it a story mode but it's not, it's a linear career mode interspersed with cutscenes that either just introduce the racing series you're about to compete in or give relevant post-race comments. The first two games though did try their hand at the story mode, and considering how old those games are, they didn't do a bad job. Around the same time there was also R Racing Evolution, which was definitely made by the Japanese. That's all I'll say. But compare all of those to MotoGP 22's 9-season 2009 mode. Yes, it is just a documentary with gameplay moments dotted throughout, but it's really well put together. It did a great job of contextualizing the season, each of the key riders and their careers before 2009, and then how that season played out for all of them. Of course, that's much easier to do when you have the history of an entire motorsport series to lean on. And you don't have to invent personalities and backstories, you just have to retell history. But that's exactly my point. Replicating the magic and intricacies of sport artificially is so tricky to do. Even filmmakers have struggled to do it well. Of course, Rush, Ford v Ferrari, and if you want to move away from motorsport, Moneyball are all great films, and in the case of Moneyball, I have no real interest or knowledge of baseball. But all of them are about real sporting events and real human beings. And that partly explains why the characters in those films are deeper and more nuanced. Also, all of those films have multiple scenes set outside of the sport for the same reason. If you want to stretch the definition, you can draw on some films that are good, based around sport, and are fictional. Jerry Maguire is probably the standout example, but that's a part sports, part comedy, part romance film, which is more about the amount of money and corporate interest in sports rather than the sports, mainly NFL, themselves. In the same way that Bend It Like Beckham is primarily about the culture clash of British and traditional Muslim values, attitudes and lifestyles. It just uses football as a setting and magnifying glass for that theme. And to bring it back to motorsport, Group B, a short film you can watch for free on YouTube set in the world of Group B rallying, is actually about survivor's guilt and grief. Given how infamously dangerous Group B rallying was, it's the perfect setting to explore those issues. It's not really a rally film though. However, some genuinely good and fictional films that are set in the world of motorsport are the Pixar Cars films. As you expect from a Pixar film, they're well produced, written, voice acted, with a plethora of varied characters, and they're nice, feel-good films with some genuinely funny moments. The first one is very typically Disney, with it being about love, friendship, loyalty, and at the end of the film, sportsmanship. But I really like Cars 3 because it tells a slightly deeper story in a slightly more grown-up way. Also, the films talk about pit stop strategies, tyre wear, full course yellows, counter-steering. Famously it talks about counter-steering, hence the whole term right to go left. And the third film even mentions the term drag coefficient, which endears it to me and demonstrates a genuine understanding and reverence for motorsport, which plenty of other films on the same topic don't. Such as, to name one example, Driven. I kind of enjoyed watching it, but objectively speaking it's pretty terrible for reasons too numerous to list. The main issue is just how ridiculous it is, and I mean more so than the animated made-for-kids Cars films. Even if you ignore the driving over coin scene and the car chase with kart cars through the streets of Chicago, and the awkward love triangles, the basic sporting plot would essentially be like if in F1 this season, or maybe last season is a better example, if Ferrari decided to sack Carlos Sainz and bring back Kimi Raikkonen to help Charles Leclerc win the driver's title. On what planet does that make sense? Days of Thunder is less cartoonish than Driven, but not in my own opinion, or going by the general consensus, a million miles better. In fairness though, the racing scenes are far more grounded than Driven's are, but the film only really makes sense if you accept that almost every character doesn't think rationally. Or, as Quentin Tarantino put it, I just don't think it works if you take the whole thing too seriously. In that same interview, Tarantino mentioned Grand Prix and Le Mans, two well-reviewed fictional racing films. The thing is though, whilst both of them are highly praised, it's more so for the cinematography and their faithful and raw depictions of late 60s F1 and early 70s Le Mans respectively. Plenty of people who have reviewed those films, whether it be critics or general audience, whether they liked or hated those films, conclude that the plots in them aren't great. Not necessarily bad, just simplistic. Of course, there have been well-reviewed and popular car films. The Fast and Furious obviously springs to mind, but that's so thematically different. It's also why I haven't talked about the Need for Speed games, which are racing games with stories attached. But they're about illegal street racing or just crime more generally, and I don't think anyone would say that the Need for Speed games tell award-winning narratives anyway. I mean, if you want to broaden out the criteria beyond motorsport games or even racing games, but to driving games more generally, for me, the shining example of decent storytelling would be Driver San Francisco. The setup for the plot is a detective who gets put into a coma and then carries on his detective work whilst unconscious in hospital. A genuinely well-told story which is reflected in the gameplay. Obviously, the whole shift mechanic that allows you to teleport into almost any other car is unique, but it has some genuinely weird and even slightly creepy missions which riff on the idea of your character being in a coma. It's a great game, and in a lot of ways the story is quite similar to the BBC TV shows Life on Mars and Ashes to Ashes. But you can see just how far you have to stray before you get to what some people call a racing game, but what I would call more broadly a driving game with a genuinely stellar story. We're about half a step away from open world games, and some of those have decent plots. GTA 4 and 5 are light years ahead of any racing game story, both in terms of premise and execution. There are plenty of good, heavily car-themed films. Drive, Baby Driver, The Italian Job, and if you want to be even broader still, something like Ronin could count as well. But how many genuinely, unironically good motorsport films are there that are not based on real-life events? Obviously, it's a subjective question, but based on popular opinion, very few. Netflix could have commissioned a 6-part series on a fictional racing driver and had complete creative freedom to have told whatever story they wanted. But instead, they chose to make one on Ayrton Senna, and given what I've been talking about in this video, it's evident why. Also, it's worth acknowledging film and TV documentaries, because there you open the floodgates. And these are all just Formula 1 related documentaries. There are plenty of other decent ones on other motorsport series as well. And personally, I'm a sucker for a good rally documentary. But back to what kicked this video off. F1 23. Time will tell how good its story mode is, but I'm doubtful. I think it's a very tricky thing to do in a racing game, and to me, goes against what I love about the F1 games and therefore makes it an utterly pointless exercise. More to the point, I don't think a grounded in reality racing game has ever told a brilliant story. Say what you want about the TOCA race driver games, but the one that's the best remembered and still the most popular today is the third one, which doesn't really have a story. MotoGP 22 had a good documentary, and Grid Legends Driven to Glory story mode was well produced and acted, but actually quite basic and cliche in terms of the narrative it told and the characters it featured. Maybe, and we'll have to wait and see. F1 23 will buck that trend.